Hello, everybody. I'm Valora Washington, CEO of the CAYL Institute, that's Community Advocates for Young Learners. Thank you so much for joining our webinar series today. As we approach the end of the CAYL Catalyst 2024 webinar series, we are reflecting on how important our theme has been this year. We chose the way forward as our theme with a great deal of intention. Pointing the way forward presents opportunities to provide direction, to inspire hope, and to build momentum for progress and growth. The way forward is a place where our values, priorities, and sense of purpose align. The way forward points us to the next best step as we carry forward lessons learned and leave behind any ideas or strategies that just don't work for us anymore. Sometimes our next best step seems so small, but we keep moving forward. We keep moving forward by being consistent, we show initiative, and we cultivate resilience. By pointing the way forward, we at CAYL hope that you will become even more empowered to take responsibility for your part in our collective journey. We know that our growth, the personal and professional way forward, often happens outside of our comfort zone. But we keep moving forward knowing we cannot do everything, but always doing the things that we can do. As thousands of you have joined the CAYL Catalyst webinar series this year, focused on the way forward, we hope that you've been informed. We hope you've been inspired. We hope that you've been strengthened and encouraged. And we're so grateful to all of the amazing panelists who have shared their expertise with us over this past year. And we definitely appreciate your presence and participation with us. As you join us today, please share your views in the chat. Tell us who you are, what you think we should be doing to point the way forward, and any questions you may have of our presenters. While you're writing in the chat, let me take care of a few housekeeping details for those of you who may be new to the CAYL Catalyst webinar series. Typically, we offer these webinars on the first Thursday of each month at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. All of our webinars are free, recorded, and available on our website so that everybody in our community can join regardless of their location or schedule. At the end of the webinar, we invite you to click a link that we'll provide in the chat if you want to join a live Q&A session with our speakers today. And after the webinar, you're going to receive an email with resources to help you dig deeper into today's topic. So we invite you to stay connected with CAYL. You can learn more about us by following us on various social media platforms, by visiting our website, or watching our YouTube channel. Thank you for being part of our community. We also invite and encourage you to support this webinar series with a financial donation. You know that our audience has reached all 50 states, and we've had participants from 65 countries, so your donation definitely makes a difference. As we continue our theme on the way forward, we're informed again by the wisdom of Sankofa, a mythical bird that looks back but moves forward. And that is an image that fits our topic today. Today, we're going to take a look back. We're going to take a look back because 10 years ago, the National Research Council issued a landmark report called Transforming the Workforce for Children Birth to Age 8. That report was over 700 pages, and it offered a comprehensive analysis of the early childhood field. It concluded with 13 bold recommendations calling for new standards, stronger systems, and increased investment in the professionals who shape children's early years. Today, we're going to look back at that report, and we're going to think about the way forward. Because 10 years later, we're wondering, where do we stand? What progress has been made? Let's take a look. And I'm really thrilled today to bring to you 3 leaders who are well positioned to help us look back with wisdom and to point the way forward with insight. I am personally honored to be in the presence of these 3 highly esteemed scholars. Dr. Ola Friday is Executive Director of the Early Education Investment Collaborative. She's a rising star with a big picture view of our field. Dr. Leah Austin is a well-known expert in early care and education systems and workforce. Her work with her colleagues at Berkeley has literally changed the conversation about the early childhood education workforce over the past 20 years. And then we have Dr. Jacqueline Jones, who is an esteemed policymaker, researcher, and educator. She's paved the way for our work in so many important roles, and she was actually part of the committee that wrote this historic report. So let's begin today by welcoming Dr. Jacqueline Jones, who can get us started in thinking about transforming the workforce report. She can bring us up to speed on what the report actually said and what it actually did not say. Welcome, Dr. Jones. Such a
Thank
pleasure
you.
to have you here.
It is my pleasure to be with you, Valora. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this 10-year look back on the Transforming the Workforce report. As a member of the consensus committee that produced the report, I'm going to try to give some historical context, outline the charge that the committee had, and then provide a very high-level overview of the report. In terms of historical perspectives, although the report was released in 2015, we already knew that adults who work with young children were underprepared, underpaid, and undersupported. In fact, Marcy Whitebook at the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment had been leading the fight for better working conditions for this workforce for decades. In 1998, Marcy and Deborah Phillips produced Worthy Work, Unlivable Wages, a review of the workforce. And 16 years later, in 2014, they published Worthy Work, Still Unlivable Wages. And I think that title is self-explanatory. Also, in 2012, the National Academies published the proceedings of a workshop that was conducted on the early childhood workforce, and that really did lead directly to the consensus committee. So the workforce was already out there as a topic of interest and concern. I think it was around 2013 when the academies convened the Committee on the Science of Children Birth to Age 8, Deepening and Broadening the Foundations for Success. That was our name. And looking back at that committee's name, it's interesting to me that it did not mention the workforce. But we were charged with making recommendations about the early childhood workforce that reflected the current science of early development. So the committee was charged with reviewing what was known about the science of early learning and figuring out what that meant for the adults who work with young children. In that regard, part of the report was a kind of update of From Neurons to Neighborhoods that had been released 10 years prior. However, I must acknowledge that from a public policy perspective, there certainly was a desire to understand what the requirements for the early childhood workforce should look like. Also note that the committee was not charged with addressing the cost of transforming the workforce. A separate report, Transforming the Financing of Early Care and Education, published in 2018, took on that challenge. So we went to work, and 689 pages later, we had Transforming the Workforce for Children Birth to Age 8, a Unifying Foundation. Those nearly 700 pages were divided into 5 sections. The first was a look at the early care and education landscape, funding streams, professional roles, variations in regulations across states. That landscape was and remains complicated. The second section was really the science of early care and education. And after reviewing the science, the committee identified 5 essential features of child development. The fact that children are learning at birth, the dynamic interaction between nature and nurture, not one or the other, but an ongoing interaction. The fact that early learning and development is broadly inclusive. It's not just social, emotional, and physical development, but it includes cognitive and subject matter knowledge skills as well. We also looked at the fact that stress and adversity can have broad negative impacts on learning. And then we looked at the fact that strong positive relationships with adults are essential. And we say that all the time in early childhood. Really, relationships are critical. But the committee made a very strong statement about what happens when the adults are under stress. And that statement reads as follows: adults who are underinformed, underprepared, or subject to chronic stress themselves may contribute to children's experiences of adversity and stress and undermine their development and learning. So, well prepared, secure, and supported adults are essential for children's healthy development. But if we don't do right by the adults who work with young children, not only can they not support learning and development, but they can have negative impact on young children. And this was, to me, one of the more critical points that we wanted to make in the report. The third section was on the implications of science for early care and education, and it included knowledge and competencies for educators and administrators. We looked at educational practices, such as technology, multi-language learners, but we also provided a set of knowledge and competencies that we thought were essential based on our review of the research. And a brief with these competencies that were identified by the committee will be included in the recording of this webinar that will be distributed next week. What do early learning professionals need? And we found that aside from these foundational and specific competencies, they need to have a real sense of being able to develop and sustain their competencies. They need high quality practice environments. They need ongoing professional support, systems and policies that support high quality practice. And all of the systems that support young children and support the adults who work with them have to be adaptive. That is, as the research continues to provide new information, these systems need to grow as we learn more. The fourth area of the report was figuring out how to develop the care and education workforce that we need. And we addressed higher education, the status and well-being of the workforce, as well as requirements for professional practice. This section included the report's most widely cited conclusion related to early educators' need for a BA degree. Now, the committee was very clear that at the time of the writing of the report, we did not have sufficient empirical evidence to claim that a BA degree would increase the quality of instruction for early childhood settings or for K-12. But we did think that having some consistency in educational expectations would really result in a much more coherent profession, that we could contribute to improving the quality of professional practice, of stabilizing the workforce, and achieving greater consistency in learning experiences and optimal outcomes for young children. But this would not come alone. This was not an easy thing. And so, in isolation, asking for a BA was not considered to be our conclusion. But looking at all the factors, higher ed access, um, funding, a range of issues that needed to be addressed. So those two, if you look in the report, you will find that we tried to take as much care as we could in saying we need a lot for teachers, and we need a lot for the systems that will support teachers in order to be effective. The last part of the report really included the recommendations. There were 13 recommendations, as Valora mentioned. They came under 7 areas: qualifications for professional practice, higher education, evaluation and assessment of practice, leadership, professionalism, interprofessional practice, support for implementation, and improvement of knowledge base. Those were important. And then at the end, there was this call to action, and it was a real challenge. And it was a challenge to the status quo. How do we take what we have and build something new? Build a system that worked for adults because it worked for young children. So I hope this very quick overview gives you a better sense of the report, its content, and context. And please know that the report and several briefs can be downloaded on the Academy's website. It is now my pleasure to turn the spotlight over to Leah Austin, who's been enmeshed in this work and has had deep understanding of how the past 10 years have played out. Leah?
Thank you, Jacqueline. And thank you, Valora, for inviting me to this panel. I'm super excited to be here with you and Jacqueline and Ola. I'm big fans of each of you, and Valora and Jacqueline, just you've also been mentors to me. You're incredible throughout many, many years. And so I'm just really thrilled that we're all here together to be in this discussion. So I just want to first say, as Jacqueline said, the report is available for free um, on the National Academy's website. And if you haven't read it, it is 698 pages. This is true. It has a very good executive summary. But if you haven't read it and Transforming the Financing of ECE, which followed, I really do highly recommend it. There are so many references and discussions that remain useful in making the case for public investment, even a decade later, that um, are highlighted in the summary, but you really get into the research and the references and the rationale in the report. So if you haven't, it's totally worth it. Don't do it all in one setting. A bunch of us, when I was at the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment, when this came out, um, a bunch of us there, along with, I think, some folks from New America, Marika Cox Mitchell, who was at NEYC, and a handful of others. I can't totally remember who made up the group, but we actually had a book club. It took us a while. It took us a long time, many, many months, but we got through it and we had a little fun in the process. But it really did give us a deeper insight, and it allowed us to pull out some really critical information and resources, and again, research and data to use in our work and to be able to share out with so many others. So just wanted to put that plug in there. So in the spirit of Sankofa and looking back, I'm going to take us just back a little bit further than a decade ago, and touch on a couple of things that Jacqueline did and add some others. It might be surprising, I think, for some in the audience now, depending on when you came into this work, to really know a time when you actually couldn't get people to talk about the workforce in a serious way, unless it was really about the inputs into them. The idea that something needed to be fixed in the people or the workforce was really a dominant discourse for a very long time. Um, when I first started working at the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment 15 years ago, like we were still a little bit of an anomaly, even though, as Jacqueline mentioned, like there were kind of pockets of folks who understood the importance of the workforce. Um, it was really, we were still an anomaly to be focused on, the compensation and working conditions and well-being of early educators. And quite frankly, not just people outside, but people inside ECE would you know kind of glaze over if you started talking about the workforce, the educators, the adults in the room with kids. Um, for those like Jacqueline, and she mentioned Marcy Whitebook, and I'd say Joan Lombardi as well, like who had long understood the importance of the well-being and conditions of the workforce. I think there was probably a hope that when Neurons to Neighborhoods came out in 2000, that the role of the adults in the room with kids would be widely understood as critical and would lead to, an improvement and investment in their conditions. And while we did see millions of dollars invested in improving quality following Neurons to Neighborhoods, that those mostly really skirted around the conditions that educators needed to thrive and be successful. So kind of fast forward a decade after that, um, and there were many folks kind of having some head scratching about why the investments that had been made were leading to some improvements, but really had not delivered on that promise of high quality early care and education um, that we got from what Neurons to Neighborhoods was showing us. And newsflash, right? It wasn't the people, the educators themselves, it was really the systems that were either supporting or undermining their ability to be effective in their teaching and caregiving practice. And so that kind of led to a little bit of a perfect storm in terms of shining a light more directly on the workforce and what's needed to support them, um, as opposed to what people were or weren't doing, correctly or incorrectly to affect quality. The federal government had renewed interest or new interest in ECE. Jacqueline and Joan Lombardi both were holding positions in the federal government that allowed them to advance some efforts. Philanthropy was developing a greater interest and investment as well. And then almost simultaneously, we get the National Survey of Early Care and Education, which was federally funded. And that gave us much needed national ECE workforce data. So that was happening. At CSCCE, the CSCCE were conducting kind of the first of its kind research on working conditions for the workforce. And as Jacqueline described, the Committee for Transforming the Workforce was coming together to create what eventually became um, this really seminal report. Um, we had the release of Worthy Work Still Unlivable Wages that Jacqueline, you mentioned in 2014, which showed that, over that period of 14 years and even further back to the very first National Child Care Staffing Study 25 years prior, despite all of those investments, wages remain stagnant, and in some cases, we're actually losing ground from 25 years prior. And that working conditions left a lot to be desired, and that educators were experiencing a lot of worry, economic worry, professional worry about their jobs and stability. And that really um, surprised people. Perhaps maybe people shouldn't have been surprised by those data, but that really surprised folks that despite all those investments, the conditions essentially hadn't changed. So that report came out. Then Transforming was released a few months later. That work had been going on. And Transforming the Workforce, as you heard, I think really reflected a depth and breadth of research that was, reinforcing what the Worthy Work Still Unlivable Wages report was showing us, what the NSCCE data was showing us about what people were earning, and some things about their working conditions, and really pointed to how our systems were woefully in need of transformation. Though, many, including educators, have kind of been waving the flag on this for a really long time. Um, Coming from the academies, bringing all of that together and transforming the workforce, this kind of real breadth of research as well as the depth, provided a validation and a legitimacy that, frankly, people just needed. There's a certain validation that comes with this coming out of the national academies and all of the experts that were involved. And so that really was important to move many policymakers and even, I think, advocates to accept and really change how they were talking about focusing on and thinking about the workforce. It really gave people permission to say, yes, policy investments and attention to the workforce to improve conditions is necessary for quality. And Jacqueline, you might correct me on this, but the Foundation for Child Development made an investment in the Early Childhood Workforce Index that I believe was really born out of a combination of the data in the Worthy Work Report and the promise and the ambition of transforming the workforce. The index, which is also coming up on its 10-year anniversary, really provides a way to assess like where are states as it relates to their policies for the things that the transforming the workforce report focuses on. Educator qualifications, educational supports, their working conditions. It talks about workforce data. There's a whole section in here that talks about the importance of data and information about the workforce. And so while people did latch on to the degree discussion, in some cases a debate, I think it was especially significant that the report really made the case of linking the outcomes for adults, not just the amount of, do you have this course or that course or which degree is going to make a difference, but the outcomes for people's well-being to the outcomes for children. really making a shift that might seem subtle when you hear it today, but really was an endorsement, I think, that many advocates and policy leaders, again, needed to pay attention to educators and engage with research that folks like CSCCE and others have been undertaking for many years. And so just before I wrap up, I want to read a quote from the report that I think speaks to this. The quote is in the summary, so if you only read the executive summary, you will get it there. But again, lots of good things in the book as a whole. Um, for for too long, the nation has been making do with the systems and policies that are, rather than envisioning the systems and policies that are needed, and committing to the strategies necessary to achieve them. Implementing the committee's recommendations will produce substantive changes that elevate the perception of the professionals who work with children from birth through age 8 and improve the quality of professional practice, the quality of the practice environment, and the status and well-being of the workforce, and ultimately outcomes for children. Having the academies lead a statement with what educators need and talking about their well-being as the lead was, believe it or not, at the time quite radical. And so I think that that's really a nuance but very important impact that transforming the workforce has had, is helping us have really those mind shifts and that attention for people to turn to the workforce in their policy and investment. So I'm looking forward to more discussion and like where are we now and where do we go? But I'm going to turn it over now to Ola.
Thank you, Leah, so much. And thank you, Dr. Washington and the whole CAYL team for this invitation to be a part of this really important and energizing conversation. So, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to continue to shine a light on progress and possibilities, a 10-year look back on transforming the workforce. Truly transforming the workforce for children birth through age 8, a Unifying Foundation and its sister report, Transforming the Financing of Early Care and Education, are truly foundational to the origins of my organization, the Early Educator Investment Collaborative. So I'll share a bit more about the collaborative, its impetus, and what we've been up to in the 10 years or so since the release of Transforming the Workforce. So about 8 years ago, a group of funders recognized that, frankly, money was required to actualize the recommendations in transforming the workforce and in transforming the financing. Right? We understood that it was one thing to put these ambitious, important goals on paper, but truly something else to support states, higher education institutions, and other systems partners to put them into practice. And there was a brief period of some federal support around technical assistance to some states, but funders really understood that they needed to stand in that gap and use their philanthropic dollars to help advance the systemic change that the reports called for. And even today, these reports and their recommendations continue to guide our work at the collaborative as we look to support bold, collaborative efforts to improve the pay, benefits, and professional learning of the early childhood education workforce. And while we know that transforming the financing report makes clear that significant public investment is, of course, essential to meet these goals, we also believe that private philanthropy can act as an amplifier, sparking innovation, accelerating momentum, and helping to demonstrate what's truly possible. And so for us at the collaborative, as we were looking to mark the 10-year anniversary of transforming the workforce this year, we saw it as a really critical opportunity to also look back at the triumphs over the last decade and also the challenges of the past decade, and to use this as a moment to continue to imagine what's possible for the decade ahead and even more. So for us, that meant that, we wanted to partner with some other national organizations, including CAYL, and we've together developed a series of reflection papers and webinars where we're elevating the ongoing efforts, right, that have transpired over the past 10 years. We're hoping to also spark some discussion like we're doing here today, and also hopefully inspire some renewed collective action towards a stronger and more sustainable early childhood system. I know that we're all committed to that. That's why we're having today's conversation. And I think you all would agree with me that, this conversation is truly happening at a critical moment. Dr. Austin, elevated many of these examples. We know that the workforce faces growing pressures, continued pressures from budget cuts and policy rollbacks to, frankly, attacks on the very value of their work still today. We know that higher education institutions are understrained. In fact, they're being targeted. We also know that immigrants and Black and Brown educators are also being targeted and disenfranchised. And our public sector employees at both the federal and state levels are really navigating a lack of support. So lots of persistent challenges, right? But we also see this as the anniversary as a moment, not just of nostalgia, so not just as a look back, which is important too, but also as a call to action, because we know that there still remains so much work to be done, right? And so we have to keep shining a light on the need for bold, sustained efforts that truly transform how we support and strengthen the early childhood education workforce. So for us at the collaborative, we've been using the report's recommendations over the past 8 years or so as our guideposts for systems change work. It's the lens through which we really think about our work, especially with our multi-sector partners. So our higher education institutions, our governing bodies and states, nonprofit partners, and of course, private funders. We focus also on bringing research to bear on policy and to practice, just as Transforming the Workforce did, right, 10 years ago. And so I want to just share some of what we've been up to as we do this look back over the past 10 years, because there are exciting models, right? There are exciting examples, even though we know that there is so much more to be done. So for us, our strategy really centers on 4 areas, and I'll just speak to them briefly with some examples. So we support research to continue to build the evidence base, right, for why this focus on the workforce is so important. And so back in 2019, 2020, we partnered with the Center for the Study of Child Care Employment with Dr. Austin and her team, the National Institute for Early Education Research, and Bellwether Education Partners to do a 50-state educator policy scan and also a deeper dive on preparation policies and compensation policies in 10 of those states. Later on, we also commissioned a national study on the feasibility of a national lead teacher credential for the workforce. We did that in partnership with the Council for Professional Recognition, with which Dr. Washington was leading at the time, and the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards to really understand what was the appetite and readiness for a national portable lead teacher credential in our profession as well. So that's some of the research. We also look at policy advancement to strengthen the public systems that shape the workforce. So one example, we partnered with First 5 Years Fund and a coalition of advocacy partners during the COVID pandemic to push for more support for early childhood educators at that time. We've also been leaning very heavily into grassroots organizing to build power among educators and families. So we've partnered with the Raising Childcare Fund to support a cohort of organizers across the country to bolster their capacity to campaign around workforce and compensation issues. And then fourthly, we also do implementation support for our partners who are on the ground so that they can test new actionable approaches. So we've really fostered some partnerships that enable what we think are risky experiments and bold innovations in early childhood workforce systems. These have really focused on transforming educator preparation and also driving sustainable compensation increases. And I know there's a lot of interest in compensation, and we're leaning really heavily into that with our partners. And I'll just give you some examples of what folks have been up to, because I think they're very exciting and they are very innovative and forward thinking and can really help to shape what's ahead for our profession. So for example, on the compensation side, our partners are advancing creative financing strategies there. We have a grant that totals $11.4 million where we're supporting 5 partnerships across the country. And these partnerships are really focused on bringing together fiscal agencies and program departments in state governments so that they can really transform how their financing systems. They can identify new dedicated revenue streams. They can revamp and rethink how they're utilizing their existing revenue streams so that they can drive more resources towards compensation for the workforce. So for example, in Louisiana, our partner, the Louisiana Policy Institute for Children, they're working with local parishes across that state so that they're able to mobilize new revenue streams and also leverage a state match to help to raise educator pay. In Washington, D.C., I know folks know all about the Pay Equity Fund, and so we're helping to support the infrastructure, the sustainability of that infrastructure so that we can drive more of those resources, those monies into the hands of programs and educators, and also expand their access to the health benefits system as well. We also have great, exciting work with our institutions of higher education. Over $15 million, we've supported over 4 years, 8 university partnerships and their state and tribal partners as well, to really transform how they're thinking about recruiting and supporting our workforce to and through the bachelor's degree program in particular, and really creating holistic wraparound supports for those educators. I have lots of examples of what folks have been up to. I'm short on time, but maybe during the broader discussion, we could talk more about that. But I do want to say that across all of our work, including preparation, credentialing, and compensation, at the collaborative, we've continued to confront this same underlying issue. I know that is common for all of us in this work, which is the historic devaluing of early childhood labor. And we've commissioned research with our partners at Child Trends to really track this devaluation. And it goes back to the unpaid and underpaid domestic labor of enslaved and indigenous women in this country. And I think we all understand that these legacies still shape our public perception of the value of the workforce today. And for us at the collaborative, we've understood that to address these really deep-rooted mindsets, we have to lean more into the narrative, right, around the workforce and the value of the workforce. And so that's a newer space for us where we're leaning into a narrative change campaign. I can share more about that. But the idea is that, I just want to end by saying that we're really proud to be playing our part in helping to realize the vision that was set out in transforming the workforce, and which is really about ensuring that early childhood educators are well prepared, well supported, and equitably compensated. And so that's just a little bit of what we've been up to in our sphere of the world. But I'm excited to be in further conversation with this great panel. So I will thank you and toss it back to Dr. Washington for our group conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As we all come together, we all just need to take a deep breath and really realize how many decades that people have been dealing with these issues and trying to change the conversation and get a different result. So, Jacqueline and Leah, you gave us a lot of the history behind work, research, and efforts that have been taken to really put a spotlight on the early childhood education workforce. I want to ask you, as we take that look back and you think about where we are today, some of the innovations that Ola talked about, How would you describe the level of progress that has actually been made? Because we've been struggling with this for many, many decades. There's lots of data, lots of research. I couldn't help but think, Leah, that many of the things that were done, the research that was done by Marcy, Deborah Phillips, that in many ways we keep saying the same thing over and over and over for many, many decades. What do you feel? How would you characterize the progress that has been made over these decades?
Okay. Are you
If you
going,
want
Leah?
to jump in, I can jump in. Well, I think I will start by saying we have a long way to go. Still and yet. But we have made progress because I think that, for example, when Worthy Work Still Livable Wages came out and Transforming the Workforce was coming out, we were starting the index. Our goal was like we were still trying to convince people, right? Like the research was there, but to Ola's point, um, there's people hold their own beliefs and values, and all of the ways in which women's work and the labor of women and the labor of Black people and Black women and immigrants has been undervalued is attached to this work. So you can put data in front of people and people aren't going to respond to it or they're not going to touch it. And so I think that's where we were even a decade ago, that we were still trying to convince people that to pay attention, to look, see, like this matters really to change the narrative. And there's still more of that to be done, but we have moved to a place of we're not trying to necessarily I mean, there's always people who need to be convinced, but when we're looking at state policies and how to drive change, like workforce is at the forefront. Um, and we're not convincing people. We're trying to help now states and local communities figure out how to do it, right? How to make change, how to change their policies. What are the policies that are needed? How do you make progress? What does that look like? Um, and so we haven't gotten all of the investment that we need, and we haven't changed all of the conditions. But I will say that there is measurable change. I mean, you could go back and look at the index and others who are doing other types of measures and tracking year by year, and we're much more focused in this collective work on like how are the policies and investments changing. Yes, let's continue to identify gaps. But I think that reflects a big shift in being able to move. That we can talk about New Mexico and the change they're making, and we can talk about the DC Equity Fund. These things are now real.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is that we've really shifted the conversation from whether we should think about the workforce or why we should think about the workforce to how can we do it.
Exactly.
What's your reflection on that, Jacqueline?
Valora, I've said this to you a couple of times. The very first NAAYC meeting that I attended, there was a demonstration, which, I mean, I had been to AERA meetings all my life, and there was this demonstration of people for worthy wages. And I thought, that's an issue? I mean, I had no idea that the workforce was an issue. I think that's not the case anymore. We certainly know it's an issue. How we handle it is certainly still out there to be figured out. I think what the committee understood was that this was a complex issue, that it wasn't just a matter of getting a degree. It wasn't just a matter of somehow having more respect for the workforce. Many, many things had to come together in a way that allowed people to have the kinds of working conditions that would allow them to do their work, that would allow them to feed their families, that would allow children to move forward. And I guess as I've looked over the past 10 years, I think these kind of place-based strategies where you can get your hands on all of these things or most of them and kind of jiggle them in some way so that they make a difference seem to be interesting. I mean, Ola talks about the collaborative and uh, the ways in which they've looked at universities, but those universities had to have partnerships, if I'm right. They couldn't just act by themselves. That's hard.
Hmm.
This is hard stuff. Changing systems is really hard. And I think we have to face the fact that this is work that was not seen as important. It
Hmm.
wasn't seen as important, and it was done by people who weren't seen as important either. So we have made progress, and I want to acknowledge that. But I think how we go forward and how we decide to invest our resources needs to be very strategic. And I think focus on the fact that one little thing isn't going to do it. You need to look in a more systemic way at how we support people.
Hmm. Yeah, I was there at that very important meeting a couple of decades ago when we had the very dramatic demonstration at NAYC about worthy wages. And I just want to lift up right now all the courageous people who, during that era, were showing a lot of courage to even bring those conversations into our own community, not to mention to the external world. Where do you stand on this, Ola?
Yeah, no, I'm agreeing with the others that we have made progress for sure. Yes, I agree. I think we're doing less of making the case on the need to pay attention to the workforce, and it's the many complicated, challenges and issues that surround that. And the work lies within this systemic approach that Jacqueline has mentioned, and how are we really intervening on all the parts of the puzzle that are required to really, to get us to where we've truly envisioned for this profession. So, but
Yeah,
I'm feeling hopeful.
right. I want to bring up the two questions that you might speak to. One is, there was a lot of conversation and debate about the bachelor's degree. You don't hear much about that anymore because I think that little thing called COVID-19 happened and people were just wanting to get people to work. And then I want to also ask you to speak on the big elephant in the room, which is compensation. And while we're thinking a lot about strategies, as you know, early childhood educators are still very undercompensated. Any comments on either of those questions, the bachelor's degree question and the compensation question?
So for the
That's me.
bachelor's
Oh,
degree question, I think we need to change that conversation to one of competencies.
Hmm.
Because you can have a bachelor's degree and still not have the competencies you need. And I think even, 10 years ago when we looked at the research, it's very hard to do research on this kind of thing. Does a BA matter? Because these BAs are different all over the place. And so I think that the idea of what are the competencies, how do we clearly articulate what people in this profession should know and be able to do is really critical. And I think we still have some discussion around that that really needs to be addressed. The compensation issue, we have built a model of for childcare and even for early learning that doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And it's built on folks not getting paid, especially in childcare. I mean, the parents can't pay. There isn't enough money to pay folks. We've built systems and we've got to rethink that. So that financing report, I was encouraged because it came out and said, this is going to cost. This is not cheap. And we shouldn't be embarrassed to say it. It's important. And so we've got to be able to start to finance programs that are built with an assumption that people can make a living wage, not a minimum wage, but a living wage for where they are. And I don't know that we're there yet. And Leah, you may have a better perspective on this, but I see programs that come up and yeah, we're going to give people $16 an hour. Well, can they live on that? I mean, if they're on the East Coast, no, they can't. Um, so I think we still have some work to do to understand that if this is a profession and this is work that is valuable, we've got to have the systems in place and the policies in place that respect that and from the get-go say we're going to pay people what they deserve.
Here, Jacqueline. And I want to build on that, but I want to go back to the bachelor's degree question just very briefly. And I think the other thing that's really important in the discussion, or whether, people want to kind of talk about, like, should we have a degree, or does the degree cut people out? Like, there's also some unpacking of that discussion
Mhm.
that I think is really important, right? Like, there is often an assumption that if um, qualifications are linked to degrees or higher levels of education, that we will lose the diversity of our workforce. Um, and like, that's just a straight line to saying people don't believe that women of color have the capacity to participate successfully in higher education, right? And really it's about, like, the systems and the conditions, and how do we remove the barriers, and how do we not ignore the existing data that shows about half of this workforce already has a degree, right? So then there is a different question about, like, the competencies around teaching and, caregiving practices that are really critical. But, like, folks are coming in, like, highly skilled with, like, years and years of experience, and have participated in education and training and all sorts of professional development. And so we're not, like, starting from scratch. And the research shows over and over that people want to participate in education and training and skill building, with the resources and conditions that allow them to be successful, and show that they can be incredibly successful with those things in place. And so I didn't want to let the moment pass without mentioning that.
Leah,
Ola, you look like you.
I would love to piggyback on that. I think what we have seen through our work with institutions of higher ed, around the BA, but also the higher education pathway, right? So the associates, or a certificate program that's credit bearing, that can lead to an associates perhaps transferring to a BA, and even a graduate degree. What we have learned is that there is an appetite in this workforce for those educational experiences. Folks are interested, excited, and hungry for them. And when we, like you said, create those conditions, we see that they're flourishing. I mean, for example, North Seattle College in Washington State, they designed the first fully BA in early childhood education in Spanish in that state. They cannot keep up with the demand, because they don't have the capacity to support all of these educators who want that degree. And other partners around the state they're saying, how can we be able to offer this as well? What do we need to do? So the demand is there. And when we create those conditions for folks to succeed around their supports, we have to be mindful that our workforce, people are working usually full time, working long hours, and also dealing with a lot of life issues. And so how are we really creating those conditions to support them? And when we do, we see so many examples of success. And so for us, it's about not this idea that some folks aren't ready or able or capable, but how do we change the systems, the structures, so that they can be supportive of those who are in fact ready, willing, and capable. So I just wanted to.
And I think we have to link compensation to this business of credentials.
Right.
Yes.
To ask somebody to go for a degree, but they're not going to make any more money, is absurd. And I think, Ola, we learned from the feasibility study. We had this great idea, national certification, portable, that's wonderful. Can you get more money from this? And if the answer is no, then I could not suggest that somebody do that. So,
Yeah.
other professions do this. You have a ladder, a career ladder, and it moves with certain credentials, but it also increases compensation. And we haven't gotten that. We've required that people get a degree, and we've not always said to them, we're going to increase compensation.
That's right. That's right,
Well, I
Jen.
think there was.
And so just briefly, Leah, but we are seeing some places where we are doing that, right? So this is the road ahead, right? So we have Maine that's saying, no, we have $32 million a year in our system for compensation for this workforce. And you get those increases as you go up our credentialing ladder. And we have New Mexico leading into that. So we have some really exciting examples, I think, that where this is exactly right, to your point, this is exactly where we need to be going. and some states are going there. Sorry, Leah.
No, I was going to say something very similar, that there are some examples of that. And I think that is an important line, is what's required versus, what's available, right? If we have these opportunities that can be made available with financing for folks, and again, those conditions in place that remove barriers, that's really important and that's really critical. But making the degree and making that participation a requirement, when there is not something on the other side, when that's not linked to compensation, I think is wholly unreasonable, to expect of folks, right? And so it's this, without that, we have to make sure our systems aren't actually creating like punishments for people, right? Like we have to look at things like QRIS, that like you get more resources, if your teachers have degrees, you are essentially like getting less access to those resources if you have teachers and staff that can't afford those degrees, right? So we like, those are also really important things as we're balancing all of this, and how to move forward, and working on, states are working on financing, to ensure that our systems aren't actually like creating greater gaps and driving some inequities that may already exist,
And I think
in
we,
the system.
I'm sorry, I think we have to acknowledge that we're working with public funds in most cases. And so this notion of how you engage in policy that can be variable, shall we say, that can change, is a real issue. So it's not just, well, can philanthropy step in? No, these are public funds, and we've got to be able to make the argument and be strategic enough to make sure we get policy that comes in and is sustainable. Not just we'll give you a bonus for 2 years. That's not how you can run a household. How do we make sure that the policies engaged in this are really making sure that people have a sustainable living wage? I think
This is such
that's
a
a challenge.
dynamic conversation. We have so many questions in the chat that we cannot get to. What I'd like to encourage each of you is to click on the chat link that we'll put in at the end of this webinar, so you can join a live conversation with our guests, because our time is so limited. So please join us in the after party to ask your questions. So many questions in the chat that we can't reach right now. So do join the after party in just a few moments. And do join us next month when we're going to talk about an example of how you really can advance and expand the workforce. And that is the Good Jobs Challenge in childcare, which we have been privileged to be a part in, which has achieved really astonishing results for early childhood educators in the metropolitan Boston area. So join us to talk about how we've achieved that and voices from the field of how we're getting that done with respect to early childhood educators. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have you with us as we look back and try to move forward. Please join us at the after party, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Good night.